explore music a bit more. I wanted to bring in more elements of music, folk, classical music even, and even elements of ethnic music.
Steve Winwood was just 15 years old when he started playing in nightclubs, an age when most teenagers were worried about homework and fitting in. But there was nothing typical about this young musician. His voice carried a depth and richness that seemed impossible for someone so young, sounding more like it belonged to a man in his 40s who had lived a full life of joy and hardship. When he sat down at the Hammond organ, his hands moved across the keys with such natural fluency that it seemed like he had been born with that instrument as part of his body. People who heard him couldn't quite believe what they were experiencing. How could someone who had barely started living sound like they understood everything about life and soul? The truth was that Winwood wasn't faking anything or putting on an act. While other young British musicians were trying to imitate American sounds they heard on records, Winwood was doing something different and more profound. He had spent countless hours listening to every recording he could find, absorbing blues, soul, jazz, and rock music like a sponge. But he didn't just listen casually or copy what he heard. He dove deep into those musical grooves, living inside them until they became part of who he was at his core. He wasn't interested in mimicking American artists. Instead, he was translating their ideas and emotions, filtering them through his own experience and creating something uniquely his own. What set Winwood apart was how his voice carried emotional weight that went far beyond what you'd expect from someone his age. His keyboard playing was equally remarkable, blending the sacred feeling of church music with the raw emotion of blues and the sophisticated complexity of jazz into something nobody else could replicate. Throughout his long career, from his early days with the Spencer Davis Group through his work with Traffic and Blind Faith and into his many decades of solo recordings, he never stopped pushing himself to explore new musical territory. He was always searching for that perfect combination where technical skill and deep emotion came together. For Winwood, certain albums weren't just records he enjoyed or even sources of inspiration. They were fundamental building blocks that taught him essential truths about music, about expressing feelings, about how to make an organ sing with life or how to let a song breathe and develop naturally. 7 albums in particular showed him that being a master of your instrument and playing with genuine emotion weren't opposing forces. They could work together, almost like dance partners moving in harmony. And when technical mastery and raw feeling came together in that perfect way, something magical happened that lifted the music to another level entirely. The first of these transformative albums was Ray Charles's recording called The Genius of Ray Charles. When young Steve Winwood heard this record, something clicked inside him and he found his true calling in life. Released in 1959, this album accomplished what seemed impossible at the time by mixing together jazz, blues, pop, and gospel music into one unified artistic statement, all centered around Ray's extraordinary voice. When Ray Charles sat down at the piano, his hands created entire musical universes. His voice had the power to break your heart one moment and lift your spirits the next, sometimes shifting between those extremes within a single musical phrase. Winwood, still a teenager in Birmingham, listened carefully to this album and realized this was what he wanted to pursue. Not copying Ray Charles exactly, but understanding what Ray understood at a deep level, that music didn't need to have strict borders between different styles, that the only thing that really mattered was genuine feeling. Ray moved effortlessly between upbeat numbers and tender ballads with complete confidence and control. His arrangements featured lush orchestral strings that gave the songs elegance and sophistication, but underneath all that polish, Ray's voice remained gritty and earthy where it needed to be. Winwood studied this balance carefully, learning how to be both sophisticated and raw at the same time, how to respect musical craftsmanship without losing the soul that made music matter. What really destroyed Winwood in the best possible way was observing Ray Charles's keyboard technique. The way his left hand walked bass lines while his right hand created melodies, the way he made the piano seem like it could talk, cry, shout, and whisper like a human voice. Winwood spent years learning this musical language, and later when his own Hammond organ filled concert halls and recording studios with sound, you could hear Ray Charles's influence in how he made those keys breathe and tell stories through chords and melodies. The second crucial album was Muddy Waters' Folk Singer from 1964. Winwood had already discovered electric blues through Muddy's earlier work, but this album showed him something completely different and equally important. Here was Muddy Waters unplugged, sitting down with just an acoustic guitar and playing. No electricity, no amplification, no effects or tricks, just pure Delta blues stripped down to its absolute essence. Muddy's voice rumbled deep like distant thunder rolling across the sky. His guitar playing was economical and perfect, with every single note landing exactly where it needed to be, nothing wasted or excessive. When Winwood heard this record, he learned a lesson that would serve him throughout his career: real power doesn't necessarily need volume behind it. Sometimes playing quietly can hit harder and deeper than playing loud. This was particularly meaningful because Muddy Waters had essentially invented electric Chicago blues and was known as the man who made the blues shout through amplifiers. So when he deliberately went back to acoustic guitar, people paid even closer attention. Songs on this album sounded both ancient and timeless, carrying a weight that came from somewhere deep and real. Winwood absorbed the most important lesson this album offered: authenticity cannot be manufactured or faked. This wasn't someone playing blues as a style or genre exercise. This was a man who had lived the blues, who carried it in his bones and blood. That realness either existed inside you or it didn't. Muddy Waters had it completely, and he showed young Winwood that all the technical skill in the world meant absolutely nothing if your heart wasn't genuinely in the music. Technique without truth was worthless. The third album that changed Winwood's musical understanding was Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, released in 1959. When Steve Winwood heard this record, time seemed to stop. This album fundamentally changed what music could be and how it could work. It introduced modal jazz, where improvisation was built on feeling and mood instead of following traditional chord progressions. Miles Davis's trumpet spoke in whispers that somehow cut deeper than any scream could. John Coltrane's saxophone seemed to be searching for something just barely beyond reach, something ineffable and profound. The entire album floated like smoke, beautiful and impossible to grasp or pin down. Even though Winwood was young when he first encountered this music, he understood immediately that this represented freedom in its purest form. These were musicians having deep conversations with each other in a language only they fully understood. The opening track featured bass and piano having what seemed like a genuine conversation, then Miles entered with a melody so simple it was almost painful in its beauty. Every musician on the album played with total restraint and control. Nothing was wasted, nothing felt rushed or forced. The spaces between notes mattered just as much as the notes themselves. Winwood studied this approach carefully, learning how silence could be part of the music, how waiting and restraint made the resolution sweeter when it finally arrived. What changed him forever was understanding the improvisation happening on this record. These master musicians weren't following any script or predetermined plan. They were creating music in real time, responding to each other moment by moment, building something together that would never exist in quite that same way ever again. That spontaneity became absolutely central to Winwood's own work. The long jam sessions in traffic, his keyboard solos that went wherever the feeling led them instead of following a map, all of this traced directly back to Kind of Blue. The fourth transformative album was Green Onions by Booker T. and the MGs, released in 1962. Steve Winwood found his own organ sound by studying Booker T. Jones. That Hammond B3 organ on this record changed what was possible in rock and roll. Booker T. played with a perfect mixture of power and restraint. The title track was essentially just a groove, simple on the surface but unstoppable in its momentum. The organ bubbled and churned while the guitar answered back and the rhythm section locked in tight. For minutes of pure soul that somehow never got old no matter how many times you heard it. When Winwood heard this music, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his own career: make the organ the lead instrument, make it sing like a human voice with all its emotional range. Booker T. and the MGs were the house band at Stax Records, which meant they backed up virtually every major soul artist who recorded there. But on this album, they stepped forward into the spotlight themselves. What Winwood studied most intensely was the economy of the playing. Nothing was complicated for the sake of being complicated. These were simply great musicians playing together, serving the groove above all else. No one took solos just to show off their technical abilities. Everything served the song itself. This discipline became fundamental to Winwood's own approach to music. Later, when he played songs with the Spencer Davis Group, you could hear Booker T's influence exploding from every note. Booker T. and the MGs taught Steve Winwood that soul was about feeling, not about race or background, that the groove was something sacred that deserved respect, and that the organ could be funky, soulful, and powerful all at the same time. The fifth album that shaped Winwood's artistic vision was The Beatles' Revolver from 1966. When Steve Winwood heard this record, his conception of what was possible in music expanded dramatically. This was the Beatles at their most experimental and fearless period. They used the recording studio itself like it was a musical instrument, employing backwards guitars, tape loops, and string arrangements that sounded almost like nightmares. Every song on the album pushed in some new direction, showing that pop music could be genuine art while still connecting with audiences emotionally. The Beatles had everything anyone could want: worldwide fame, enormous wealth, millions of screaming fans. They could have kept making simple love songs forever and maintained their success. Instead, they risked everything by chasing something deeper and more real. That courage inspired Winwood profoundly. When he eventually left the Spencer Davis Group at the peak of their commercial success to form Traffic, Revolver was part of the reason he felt brave enough to make that leap. Sometimes you had to walk away from safety and certainty to find something authentic and meaningful. The sixth album was John Coltrane's A Love Supreme from 1965. Steve Winwood called listening to this record a genuine spiritual experience. This was prayer transformed into music, divided into 4 parts that represented one complete spiritual statement. Coltrane's saxophone seemed to be reaching for God, finding God, thanking God. The entire album felt worshipful, but it was worship that challenged the listener, that pushed boundaries, that demanded everything from both the players and anyone listening. When Winwood heard this music, he understood that music could be sacred, that the act of playing could be a form of prayer. Coltrane's saxophone on this album didn't just make pleasant sounds or demonstrate technique. It made profound statements about existence and faith. The whole band played with a sense of devotion and ceremony, where every note carried weight and every moment mattered. Winwood absorbed this understanding deeply. Music wasn't merely entertainment to pass the time. It was communication with something higher than everyday life, something beyond what words could express. What changed Winwood most was witnessing Coltrane's total commitment and dedication to the music, to the search for truth through sound. The seventh and final album that Winwood chose was actually Traffic's debut record, Mr. Fantasy from 1967, his own band's first album. He didn't pick this from ego or vanity, but because it represented a truth about his artistic journey. Mr. Fantasy captured something he had spent his entire career pursuing, for musicians making music that drew from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, mixing rock, jazz, folk, soul, and psychedelia together with no rules or boundaries, just pure exploration. They recorded it in a cottage in the English countryside, away from all distractions and pressures, simply making music because they felt compelled to create. What made this album sacred to Winwood was the freedom it represented. For the first time in his career, he wasn't following anyone else's rules or expectations. The Spencer Davis Group had produced hits and commercial success, but this was different. This was a risk, a leap into the unknown. This was 4 musicians trusting each other completely and following wherever the music wanted to go naturally. Mr. Fantasy taught Steve Winwood his most important lesson of all: trust the music itself, follow the feeling wherever it leads, because the best songs aren't really written through conscious effort. They're discovered, and discovery requires the courage to get lost first before you can find something truly valuable. Steve Winwood never stopped exploring and pushing himself musically. These 7 albums taught him about soul, blues, jazz, courage, and freedom. His organ learned to sing because these master recordings taught it a language. Each album contributed something essential to his development as an artist, showing him different aspects of what music could be and what it could accomplish. From Ray Charles he learned about breaking down barriers between genres. From Muddy Waters he learned about authenticity and power in simplicity. From Miles Davis he learned about improvisation and the importance of space. From Booker T he learned about groove and economy. From the Beatles he learned about fearless experimentation. From John Coltrane he learned about music as spiritual practice. And from his own work with Traffic, he learned about trusting the creative process itself. Retry.